somebody be so kind as to make a motion to approve the agenda, moved by David and seconded by Mason. All in favor? Sorry, all in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, okay, carried. Thank you. Are there any disclosures of interest? Seeing none from the gallery at home, the mayor has a lot of people speak in third person. I have a couple. We have some grant considerations coming forward. I have earlier declared on department report number 4 item, cultural event funding. There's two events that take place that my business has been involved with, at least in sponsorship in the past. So I'll be declaring on those two items. And thank you for that. With respect to the minutes of May 4th, 2020 Budget Committee and May 4th, 2020 Council Committee, would somebody be so kind as to make a motion to accept those minutes? Moved by David, seconded by Pat. Any discussion, errors or omissions noted? All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Carried. Thank you. There's some slow video. There are no consent agenda items on this particular agenda. Board reports, same thing. Council referrals. And we have one from AMO, or as Mason well knows, it's the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, requesting municipal resolution regarding blue box transmission of full producer responsibility. And I'll turn to our staff and ask if there's somebody introducing this. I would assume it would be Mr. Preston, so I'm going to, now he becomes an active camera on my screen. Oh, and Mr. Shell looks like he's pitch hitting for Mr. Preston. Sorry, before we go there, Councillor Klooster, you have a comment?
Yeah, sorry, through you, Mayor Clark. I will be declaring a conflict as well on the funding for the Streets Alive, as my company, we are one of the sponsors as well.
Okay, and so I think staff are now noting the which report that is. It's the same report, I guess, that I declared on. And thank you for that, Councillor Klooster.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, he said his company is a sponsor. Councillor Sapola, Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also have a conflict. The Rotary Club of Orillia sponsors one of the things on the Streets Alive. So I don't know if it's a conflict or not, but I will be declaring a conflict. I'm a member of the Rotary Club and past president.
Okay. When we get to that item, we'll probably need just a slight pause in the action so that staff can separate those resolutions for debate and for consideration and voting. So we'll deal with that when we get there. If anybody else realizes that they may have a conflict as we get through this, just bring it to the attention of the chair, and we'll deal with it at that time. So with that being said, Mr. Preston, you're either now a member of council or you're now introducing a report. I'm sure that you are smart enough to know that you probably should be here to avoid being on council. So I'll let you introduce your report.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Through you, Mayor Clark, if I could. The purpose of this report is to discuss the Association of Municipalities of Ontario's request for a municipal resolution regarding the city's preferred date for the transition of the Blue Box program to full producer responsibility. AMO is requesting a resolution from the city that encompasses the following: Council's preferred date to transition based on existing service provision, the rationale for this transition date, whether the city is interested in potentially continuing to provide services, and key contacts if there are any follow-up questions in regards to the resolution. In August of 2019, Minister Jeff Urich of the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks announced that municipal blue box programs will be transitioned to full producer responsibility over a 3-year period. The municipal transition is proposed to occur between 2023 and the end of 2025. Transition of individual municipal blue box programs to full producer responsibility is to occur in phases over the 3 years, with a rolling total of up to 1/3 of the provincial program transitioning on an annual basis. AMO indicates that the resolutions it is requesting for municipalities will be used to map out an ideal transition timeline and to determine whether there are years that either they are under or oversubscribed. This information will also allow AMO and the province to better understand whether there are potential conflicts and what may be necessary to address them. I have Mr. Preston here with us, who authored the report and is our expert in this area, and he will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, and I turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. And as I like to refer to Mr. Preston as a fellow dumpster diver.
Badge of honor.
Okay. Oh, badge of honor. It is indeed. And don't let anybody tell you differently. Okay. I will now, unless there's an alternative direction, which I'm not aware of, I will ask staff to put on the screen the proposed resolution, and I'll ask for a mover and a shaker, mover and a seconder. And here it is here. I can read it and then ask for a mover and a seconder. I suppose that's what I will do. Whereas the amount of single-use plastics leaking into our lakes, rivers, waterways is a growing area of public concern. And whereas reducing the waste we generate and reincorporating valuable resources from our waste stream into new goods can reduce greenhouse gases significantly, known as GHGs. And whereas the transition to full producer responsibility for packaging paper and paper products is critical to reducing waste, improving recycling, and driving better economic environmental outcomes. And whereas the move to a circular economy is a global movement, and that the transition of the blue box programs would go a long way towards this outcome. And whereas the City of Orillia is supportive of a timely, seamless, and successful transition of blue box programs to a full financial and operational responsibility by producers of packaging paper and paper products. And whereas the AMO, or the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, has requested the governments, municipal governments with blue box programs to provide an indication of the best date to transition our blue box program to full producer responsibility. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the City of Orillia's preferred date to transition into its blue box program to full producer responsibility be January 1st, 2024, and that the preferred date is based on the following rationale or criteria. Number one, larger municipal programs are expected to be transitioned early to set the framework for further transitions. And two, if the blue box collection program transitions to a new service provider, the city will want to ensure a smooth transition. And that the City of Orillia expresses its interest in providing collection services to producers should mutually agreeable commercial terms be established, and that any questions regarding this resolution be directed to Greg Preston, who wears a badge of honor, Manager of Environmental Services at 705-325-2444, or gpreston@orillia.ca, and that the resolution be forwarded to the Association of Municipalities of Ontario and the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. And now I'll go back to that. Well, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Clerk. I'll ask for a mover and a seconder first, if that's okay, Mason, unless you have an alternative direction. Mason, are you want to move this? Yes.
Yes, yeah, that's great, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. And seconded by Councillor Sepola or Ralph. Now we'll entertain discussion. Tim, then Mason, and Ralph.
Thanks, Steve. I just had a quick question on some of the wording in the motion, and then I might speak to it. But I'm wondering if somebody could define haulage processing for me.
If I can, through you, Mr. Chair, what that means is hauling our recycling material from Orillia to a processing facility. Processing means sorting that recyclable material into like materials and then shipped off to other markets for recycling. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you both. Tim, you're good with that, or you have follow-up?
Yeah, if I could follow, I might as well follow up right now. I have increasing concerns about the Blue Box program. I'm pretty close to rendering it inefficient and ineffective, and I think we as a municipality have to start sort of watching our own plastic. I'm specifically concerned with plastics mainly. I mean, they call them recyclable, but all they are, recyclable once or twice, and then they're the same problem that single-use plastics are, right? So the issue, I think, is what we would do as a community to monitor our own plastic use and our own quality of plastic that we're shipping out, right? So the Recycling Council of Ontario recently announced that they're going to loosen the oversight on the Blue Box program when it goes to the stewards. So if we lose that oversight, I mean, we may feel good here as a community in Orillia because we're recycling, we're doing everything right, and it's leaving the community, and we have a nice warm fuzzy feeling that it's going to be all recycled and reused or whatever. And it isn't. It's going to be put in somebody else's hands, and we'll have no idea. I mean, we can make some checks on it, but I don't know if we have enough control. And so where I'm going with this is I'm wondering, do we also, when we're negotiating with the stewards, do we want to include the concept that we may be in control of the quality of that transfer station? Now, I know that's kind of all over the map, but I'm hoping you know where I'm going.
Yeah. To you, Mr. Chair,
Sorry, Greg, just one sec. So I know that you and I have had a couple of discussions on this, Greg, and maybe you could, I know you understand Councillor Lauer's question, but maybe just to expand on that a little bit and speak to roughly what the percentage of diversion we believe our Blue Box is actually involved in the end, and transitioning into new products, and now and subsequent to what Mr. Councillor Lauer is talking about.
To you, Mr. Mayor, so our capture rate is quite high for the Blue Box program, over 85%. So that means that 85% of all materials that could go into the Blue Box are ending up in the Blue Box. It's actually higher. It's about 88% now. So we know that there's a very good participation from Orillia residents. To get to Councillor Lauer's question, the regulation that would oversee this transition is under development in 2020. The idea is that the province would set targets on what those capture rates would have to be by industry to regulate them, to say that they would have to meet those targets or there would be some sort of penalty. Again, the regulation is under development this year, so that's something staff will watch very closely and comment on as the regulation moves forward, and in any negotiations that we would proceed with in 2023 or whenever, we would want to make that point very clear that we would expect that material to be recycled. I mean, it's a lot of money being paid to recycle that material, so we'd want to see that it is in fact being recycled. Thank you.
You're muted.
Tim, if you have a follow-up, go right ahead.
Okay, so, sorry, Steve, thanks. I couldn't read your lips there. Okay, so first of all, I'm certainly have no concerns with the participation rate in the city of Orillia. I think we're probably outstanding in that regard, and it's being proven through the awards that we win regularly. My concern is with, and I guess I should have narrowed it down at the first a little bit more, is with plastic. Plastic to me is just not working. It's and we're kind of comforted by the fact that we call it recyclable and we're going to get rid of single-use plastic, but it's plastic and it's going to eventually end up in the system, and it's going to eventually, as a toxin, not do us any good. So what I'm worried about is that we enter into this agreement with the Blue Box program, the stewardship program. We happily wave goodbye to our plastics and watch them leave the town, and have no idea where they're going or what real quality of oversight is going on there. Now, I know you're saying that they're developing policy, but certainly the Recycling Council of Ontario have had pretty significant concerns when the announcement first came out, and called it the ruination of the program, actually, because of the lack of oversight. So I guess where I'm going, and I don't know how it would ever play into this, is at some point, if we didn't have faith in those oversights, if we didn't have faith in what was happening to our plastics through our recycling system, process, I'm wondering what recourse would we have? Would we, and I'm just to suggest one, would we be able to go into the transfer station and start monitoring what's going on there and actually tracing and following?
So I'll let Greg weigh back in on that. And Greg, if there is an additional action that we can take as a city, would that be something we would consider today, subsequently, or even subsequently after the new regulation came in, so we could see what kind of teeth it would have?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yeah, that's something I would suggest we look at as time goes on, not necessarily today, but it's certainly something we can keep in mind as the regulation is developed. They are holding consultation sessions where we could provide further feedback as we see it develop, particularly when we see the draft regulation come forward. That would be of particular interest. One point I wanted to make too, as well, is one of the purposes of doing this and why municipalities support it is you're also putting the control of the life cycle analysis of these products in the hands of producers. So the hope is that they make better packaging decisions to start with, so that we're not stuck with challenging plastics like plastic film and styrofoam, too low value materials. So the hope is with producers looking at the life cycle and the costs of these things, they will make hopefully more environmentally and economically beneficial decisions when it comes to what packaging they actually put on the market in Ontario overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Greg. Tim, if you want to jump back in, I'll come back to you in a moment. I think I had Mason and then Ralph and Q.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I know we could spend all day on this particular topic in regards to waste and responsibility and such. Essentially, this particular motion is just asking for support to send information and support to AMO and to the province to get the ball rolling on these things. And I think that's important to focus on that. Obviously, this is just one step of many in the right direction. Tim is bang on when he talks about, there's larger issues at play in regards to usage of plastic and things. And I really think it's it's more of a cultural issue that's very big in regards to what we use all the time, in regards to what we buy with our products, where we eat, things like that. But this particular item that we're talking about is something, moving towards that direction. And it's putting that responsibility on the people who produce this waste and these plastics and all these other things, which is, reducing the money that the average taxpayer is going to be paying for that. And I think that's the important thing to focus on. I'm always happy to discuss, the bigger picture, but I think we just need to focus on the motion.
Thanks very much for that, Mason. I'll now go to Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple of questions. Councillor Ainsworth touched on a couple of them, or one of them. What does this mean to our taxpayer? I read the financial impact, but maybe Mr. Preston or Mr. Shaw can explain the savings to the taxpayers in this community or the costs, the 120,000 processing and so on. So just an explanation so our taxpayers get a handle on what this means to our city. And then I have one more question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Preston or Mr. Shaw.
I can answer for Andrew if that's okay. So yeah, the idea is that the new program, once fully transitioned, we would have 100% of the costs of running the residential Blue Box program covered through the producers. That would not include the collection and processing of Blue Box material from the industrial, commercial, and commercial sector, industrial, commercial, and institutional sector. So that represents about, the IC&I sector, or the business sector, represents about 10% of all the collection that we do in Orillia. So overall, we would see about a $1.3 million in savings from the program. We'd still have to pay about $120,000 to collect Blue Box material from the business sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to thank you for the report. It's excellent. Well done. Councillor Ainsworth touched on where we buy our product and how we take it home. I think it's a key to the success of this thing. I'm wondering if we could consider a marketing program to when you go shopping and that kind of stuff, to make sure that you buy it the right place and the right, bring it home in the right bag or whatever. The other thing, Mr. Preston, you and I chatted about this a few times about having the city having its own sorting. Because I agree with Councillor Lara, once it leaves Orillia, we don't know where it goes. But if we had our own sorting facility, A, we would create jobs, and B, we would control what we had. Has any consideration been given to that?
Mr. Preston?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, generally, sorting of Blue Box recycling is done on a regional scale. So you have some municipalities like the city of Guelph do their own sorting, but they're drawing from not just the city of Guelph, they're drawing from the county of Wellington and other areas surrounding. So if we were to do that, we'd want to look at not just Orillia's, but other areas as well. And the county of Simcoe is actually looking to construct essentially a consolidation facility where Blue Box material would go, be consolidated, and then shipped to market from there. And we have it in our collection contract with Mid-Ontario that we have the option of using that facility while we still have, while we have that relationship with Mid-Ontario. If stewards take over the program in 2023 to 2025, they will likely want to have regional areas where they would send this material to, just for economies of scale. So we haven't looked at it specifically for Orillia. We've looked at it in terms of using the county facility, but we haven't looked at it specifically for setting one up here in Orillia. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now have Councillor Heen.
Yes, on the rationale for the transition date, you stated that the larger municipal programs like the City of Toronto are expected to transition early to set the framework for further transitions. Do we have any real indication that the larger cities will move forward quickly? Because that certainly would determine why we would set our date when we are.
Mr. Preston?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mayor, when Andrew and I were working with our consultant EXP on the collection contract, his expectation was that they would work out the arrangement with the City of Toronto first, work out the kinks with them, and then move forward, because that you get a lot more people on the program quickly by going with a larger municipality. So that's where we got that point from, and I haven't looked into it any further than that, but I would fully agree with EXP that that's where what we would see. It makes the most sense in terms of moving it forward promptly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Councillor Jay.
Thanks, Mayor Steve. Through the chair, I just wanted to add my comments, and they're very much in line with Councillor Lauer's. I think just kind of looking over the overall proposal, I think the concept is a really good one. There are, of course, question marks around how it's going to be laid out from an operational standpoint, and I think that's where we kind of don't know, yet what it's going to look like. But I think the mentality behind it, the idea that the producer should be taking on the responsibility, I think is actually a really good idea. And I think an example where it's been really effective has been the beer store, where they take the empties and basically turn them right around. The question mark, of course, can it always be that operationally great? Are there going to be the stipulations in place to ensure that, every producer is as, on top of things? I had some questions for Greg, about some of the details, and I assume a lot of the details have yet to be released, but I figured I'd pose these questions just to see if there might be some answers. I wanted to ask, how will this change the operation of our landfill? And I wondered also about and I don't know if you have the answer to this already, but let's say there's not an identifiable producer to an item that's being recycled, how will that be dealt with? Is that going to be collected up, or would that be refused? Could that lead to more waste in our landfill? Thanks.
I don't want to put words in Jay's mouth, but I think he meant our waste diversion site.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. The impact of the waste diversion site, we don't know fully. At this point, we might be following a similar program as the province of British Columbia, where they have a set list of blue box materials that are collected in Orillia's program, similar to Orillia's program. The only difference is plastic film and styrofoam are not collected curbside in BC. They are picked up, they're dropped off at a depot. So if that's how we would work with the new program, then our depot for styrofoam and our depot for plastic film at the waste diversion site would become ever more important and probably a lot more busy, because if Orillia was to follow exactly how the BC program was to occur, then those items would be drop-off only. That would be a decision of council at that time to decide how it wanted to do that. It would mean we would not necessarily get covered fully for collection of styrofoam and plastic film at the curb. It would have to be, they'd pay for drop-off only and leave it at that. So we might see an impact there with at our landfill where for styrofoam and plastic film. As for the non-identifiable items, right now, if you're putting a product on the market is a blue box material, you are legally required to report or register with Stewardship Ontario to indicate how much you're putting on the market and your sales, and you're then a registered steward that pays into the program to help cover it. I'm not aware of there being issues with items that aren't accepted in a blue box program where you don't have a steward to go back with, but I will monitor that moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay, you good? Go ahead.
Thanks.
Jay,
Sorry, thanks. Through the chair, just a quick question there. And again, this is situation specific on details, but hypothetically, if there's a situation where let's say producers are collecting certain recyclables but aren't collecting all of the potential recyclables, would there be a potential the city could collect the rest? I don't know if that's something that's that you might be able to speak to there.
Greg?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, that is definitely a potential. One thing we might see is if we want to maintain a program that's over and above what the provincial program would call for, we would just basically have to pay the cost of that added service. So for example, when I was talking earlier about the IC&I sector, the business sector, the city would still have to pay for the cost of collecting blue box materials from the IC&I, from the business sector. So that would be one service that the council would have to say, yeah, yay, we'll continue doing that. But like you say, if there's additional things that we want to collect and recycle that would be over and above the program, we would likely just, as a city, have to pay that added cost to do that extra material. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Greg. Ted, the ever patient Edwin.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Through you, if I may, a question for Greg. Has any jurisdiction anywhere in the world introduced this program to this point in time? And so much, the follow-up of that is, is it, what's happened sort of thing. But my concern is that so much of our manufactured packaged goods are manufactured outside of Canada. And to what degree do we have control over goods manufactured, say, in the United States or in China? And what protections are there in the program as it's contemplated that would prevent the manufacturers from just passing the cost of packaging on through the cost of product, as opposed to engineering a reduction in the packaging itself?
Greg?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the existing program catches that by saying if you're a first importer, so if you're importing products from China or wherever and you're putting them on the Ontario market, you still have to pay a fee to help pay up to 50% of the costs of running Ontario municipal blue box program. So I would envision that the legislation would cover that loophole to make sure that, if you're importing, you're still paying into the system. So you have an incentive to say, hey, manufacturer in China or wherever, this is what we want, because we have to pay for the life cycle of this packaging product. So we might see it there, but you're exactly right. It is a global economy. Decisions aren't necessarily made in Ontario. They're made all around the world. There have been more stewardship-like programs in Europe like this. BC is the Canadian example that Ontario will likely watch closely. And there have been challenges there, but it's also, I understand, running fine to that I think that we would probably see a lot of similarities to the Ontario and BC programs there. Thank you.
Thank you both. Any further questions, comments, discussion? Councillor Ralph. And then Tim, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, you and I have been working on single plastic use for almost 6 or 8 months now. Do you know where we stand with that? Because that's relevant to this. And my other concern is how do we market this to the people that it's not going to cost them any money, that we do have a saving of $1.1 million eventually? Can't hear you.
Appreciate the fact that you said we've been working on this. I would say we're both passionate about it. I'm sure others around the table are as well. But the work really has been going on in our environmental services and operations department. So I'm going to certainly let Mr. Preston or Mr. Shell, who have been doing most of the work on this, weigh in on that, please.
I can comment first. We are working on that report. It's still under development. Councilor Eamon had a comment at an earlier council meeting about contacting local industry to get their feedback. So we've been attempting to do that with the COVID-19 pandemic. It has slowed things down to some extent, but we do have a plan to keep that moving forward and getting that to you within months. Thank you.
Supplementary, if I may, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead, Ralph.
Thank you. We have a date on here of 2024, and it says approval of this option would not be binding on the city. I'm just concerned that this council is very pro this particular issue. If the next council comes along and says, wait a minute, we don't want to belong to this, do they have an option, or do they have to abide by the rules and regulations that the province puts in? I'm concerned about the date. If Orillia wants to do it, why can't we do it in 2022, January 1st, where this council is still in power?
Great.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So the idea right now is just to get an idea of when municipalities prefer to transition. And as Councilor Sepola pointed out, it's a non-binding resolution. It's just to show your preference, because we have to keep in mind that there are hundreds of programs across the province that would need to transition because of the municipalities there are in Ontario. So it's going to take time to do that. So the two options, as noted in the report, are: one, we continue to provide that service and receive a reimbursement, or two, a new service provider comes in and takes over that portion. So I think that it's going to be a regulation essentially that says municipalities are no longer required, as they are now, to collect blue box material. It puts the onus onto industry. I'm not aware of what happens if municipalities don't want to transition. At present, we get 50% of the net cost of running our blue box program, and that would continue until I guess the end of 2025 if the city chose not to. In terms of Councillor Sepola's question about why can't we transition earlier, this is set by the province, so we have to follow what the dates that they set forth. And as Mr. Shell pointed out earlier, those dates are between January 1st, 2023 and December 31st, 2025. So that's something we have to follow, and something we'll watch as the regulation is developed later this year. Thank you.
Thank you both. Tim, I believe you had your hand up to weigh back in.
Thanks, Steve. Just to wrap up my previous comments, certainly I agree with Mason and Jay. This is a great idea. The stewardship program is obviously the only way to go. It should have happened a long time ago. My concern only is, we're excellent recyclers of glass, metal. We do pretty well with paper, but we are not good with plastics, and that's obvious all the way around the world. So what I was afraid of was that if we were doing something today that would truncate any kind of ability that we would have to oversee what goes on in the future or negotiate. That was my concern. It sounds that certainly from what Greg is saying, that we will have the opportunity to have that discussion down the road. So I'm in favor with moving ahead today and keeping that on everybody's agenda.
Thank you. That's great. I think that was a pretty robust discussion. Unless somebody else desperately wants in, I will now call the question. I have read it. It was a little while ago. Would anybody like it reread? All right. I will. Thank you very much. I will now call the question. All in favor? Thank you. Greg, you didn't vote. That is passed. That is carried. Thank you very much. And thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Greg. Okay, we're now on to council referral number 2 with respect to heavy truck restrictions. I believe the screen is going to expand for me, and Mr. Sugden and Mr. Duca will be there to introduce the issue. At least Mr. Sugden. Ian, all yours.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. So report number DSE 2014 presents the findings and recommendations from staff related to the council referral, which was a letter of concern from Mr. Scanlon on who resides on Peter Street North with respect to the request to remove the heavy truck restriction on West Street North between Coldwater Road and Fittins Road. West Street North is one of the city's arterial roads. Arterial roads are designed to accommodate high volumes of traffic and are providing through routes for the movements of goods and services and people throughout the city. Removing the heavy truck restriction on this section of West Street North between Coldwater and Fittins would provide a direct route north from the downtown Orillia to Highway 11. This will minimize the number of trucks that would choose to utilize local parallel roads to West Street, such as Peter Street North. Allowing heavy trucks to utilize the most direct route along West Street North also reduces climate impact from these vehicles. West Street North between Coldwater Road and Fittins Road has fewer traffic controls compared to the parallel local roads, which in turn minimizes the number of times heavy trucks have to brake to stop and accelerate. In summary, to promote effective use of the city's road network by minimizing heavy truck traffic on local roads while taking steps to positively address climate change, staff recommends that the existing heavy truck restriction on West Street North between Coldwater and Fittins Road be removed. Happy to answer any questions.
Indeed. Thank you, Ian. Before we get to that point, I will ask the motion be put on the screen for our viewing audience. I will read it, and then I will ask for a mover and a seconder, and then and definitely welcome discussion. That this committee recommends the council that has recommended report DSC 2014, as Ian mentioned, dated May 19th, 2020, from the DSE Department, or the Development Services and Engineering Department, Traffic and Parking Regulation Bylaw number 200755, be amended to remove the heavy truck restriction on West Street North. And is there a mover and a seconder for that? Moved by Pat, seconded by Mason. Is there any discussion? I will now call the question. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Go ahead. Okay, we're now on to department reports, and we have one with respect to cannabis, location of cannabis retail stores. And I believe that Mr. Crawford, who's here live and in person and safely distanced, I will tell you and reassure everybody, is going to introduce this report. Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I need to hear you. You got your speaker on there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've been fielding a lot of questions actually lately about the city's role in cannabis retail stores. So I'd like to touch briefly on that, and then I'll get into the specific report itself. So to begin, it's the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario that licenses cannabis retail stores. It's not the city. And if anyone wants to operate a cannabis retail store, they must apply to the AGCO and go through a public notice process. And the municipality and the residents of the municipality have up to 15 calendar days to provide input respecting a proposed cannabis retail store. This input is something that the AGCO takes into account. They don't have to take it into account, but they may or may not. Ultimately, it's the AGCO's call on whether to authorize a store or not. If we go back to 2019, when council established criteria that city staff would use to provide input with respect to retail stores. So there was a number of areas that were identified as sensitive uses. And so this criteria says that, for example, we don't believe it's in the public interest for a cannabis retail store to be located within 150 meters of a child care center. The motion that's before you today, staff is recommending a couple of changes to the criteria. We believe these changes to be somewhat non-substantive in nature. The first particular changes is requesting that city-owned recreational trails be removed from the criteria. In addition to that, staff is recommending that how we apply the 150-meter setback from specified uses be changed so that it's consistent with the provincial legislation and how the province would apply the 150-meter setback in relation to schools. So those are the two key changes that staff is asking council to consider making to the criteria. And in recommending those changes, staff is mindful of a couple of key facts. Firstly, staff is mindful that cannabis is now a legal product. It's similar to alcohol. And if we think about it, we don't have any criteria established for stores that sell alcohol. In addition, staff was mindful of, the overriding principles or purpose of why cannabis legalization occurred in the first place, which was to try to combat the illegal cannabis market and to ensure that those persons that wish to purchase cannabis can get a safe product as opposed to getting it from the illegal market. So those are my comments. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Again, I'll ask our very capable staff to put the resolution on the screen. Here it is here. I'll read it and ask for a mover and a seconder to put it on the floor. This committee recommends the council that is recommended in report CD 2005. And thank you for that, Mr. Crawford. I was negligent. Thank you. Dated May 20th, 2020, from the Clerk's Department, the section of Chapter 251 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code, delegated authority pertaining to cannabis retail stores be amended as set out in the Schedule A in our report, which includes removing city-owned recreational trails from the criteria and changing how the 150-meter setback is determined from specific uses. Is there a mover and a seconder? Moved by Pat, seconded by Dave. Thank you very much. I will now entertain discussion. Pat.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions for Mr. Crawford, and we spoke earlier this morning. Excuse me. My questions pertain to actually how much the Alcohol and Gaming Commissioner actually takes into consideration the regulation or the bylaws that we have in place, and I guess that they relate to the fact that the two of the people that have applied are on Mississauga Street. They're not the 150 meters apart that we have in our bylaw, and one of them is also too close to the meth clinic. Do they take into consideration our bylaws, or they just do what they want?
Mr. Crawford.
Through Mr. Mayor, at the end of the day, the AGCO makes the final call. The city's role is strictly as a commenting agency only. Right now, there are 3 applications that have been made for cannabis retail stores in our community, 2 being on Mississauga Street and 1 up on Diana Drive. Those again are all in process right now. We're not clear whether the AGCO is going to issue those licenses and whether or not they will take into consideration the city's criteria or not. So bottom line, it remains to be seen whether or not the AGCO will take into account the criteria. We should know soon, but I don't know right now.
Thank you both. Ralph?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just had a couple of questions. One is the 150 meters to the, and Councillor Heen touched on it a little bit, to the methadone clinic. The corner on Peter and Mississauga, will the province, as you just said earlier, can we send a letter objecting to it, and if council wishes to do that, that it is within that zone for us?
Mr. Crawford.
Through Mr. Mayor, yes, we actually have submitted comments to the AGCO advising that the one proposed store is located too close to the methadone clinic and is contrary to our criteria. Again, those comments have been submitted. At the end of the day, it'll be up to AGCO to decide whether or not that will be enough for them to deny the application itself.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rob?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Crawford. With some of the applications with the cannabis stores going into the downtown core and one out in Diana Drive in Westridge, has the AGCO looked at what happens when convenience stores start selling beer, for example, when you've got all these different outlets in certain areas, to say, will it have to change some of their boundaries and framework to maybe limit how many stores they put close to proximity?
Mr. Crawford, if you're able.
Through Mr. Mayor, I'm not aware of the AGCO looking to impose any additional restrictions at this time.
Thank you. Thank you both. Further questions, comments? Ralph?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's an article in Orillia Matters today about quoting me that, first of all, I just want to reiterate that I am not against a store opening up. I'm just opposed to the way the one looks at Peter and Mississauga with that signage and everything else. I mean, it's not about me. It's not whether I agree or don't agree. I mean, doesn't matter where they open, but how do you make sure that our children and our grandchildren, when they're walking by, and I know they're going to be selling food products in there as well, how do we tell them that they can't eat it, they can't do it? I mean, is the Liquor Control Board going to be able to allow us to, through social media or through proper advertising along, even in one of their windows, saying something that is detrimental to your health for young children? World Health Organization just outlined that cannabis affects children's minds, the growth of their brain till I think they're 21, 22, 23, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it is an education process. And how do we deal with it as a municipality to protect our children and our grandchildren?
I'm trying to draw a connection between the question and the motion before us. I'm going to suggest that if it's a location-based question in that there's a lot of children that could go in this area, then I'll allow the question, and I will ask Mr. Crawford if you're able to comment on that, if you could, please.
Through Mr. Mayor, with regard to the one that Councillor Sapola mentioned in terms of the existing signage, that existing signage does not adhere to the city's sign bylaw, and that particular location business owner has been notified of this and is actually in the process right now and working on new signage that will fully adhere to our signage criteria as per Chapter 832 of the city's municipal code. The other thing I wanted to mention is just in terms of the product itself, The not municipal rules, but rather the provincial rules dictate that the product can't be visible from the street. So there has to be some sort of visual barrier to prevent, for example, kids going down the street and seeing these products displayed in the window.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. Ted.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. I have two questions, if I may, through you. Well, I have one question, one comment. Let me make the comment first. That, you know, we have a tremendous burden in our community as a municipality to regulate things. And regulating how our parents raise their children doesn't strike me as being something that is within our jurisdiction. So I'm afraid that I'm not. I think it's the parents' responsibility to educate their children with respect to the use of these products and services. They're prevented until they're 18, just as they are, or 19, I don't know what the age is, just as they are with alcohol. But my question is that store on the corner, is it within 150 meters of the new health clinic that is opening on Peter Street across from Brewery Bay in the building that used to house the Steenhoff?
Mr. Crawford, if you're able to answer that.
I'm not aware, to be honest.
And my follow-up would be that if it is, the fact that, Mr. Mayor, the follow-up is, if it is within the 150, the fact that they have announced that they're going in there, are they then, if they get would the commission consider that a grandfathering issue, or on the basis that I assume once you get a license and get established, if they move to school next door, they would still be allowed to operate as opposed to having to cease operation?
Thank you very much, Councillor Eamon. I believe the question, Mr. Crawford, is if it is discerned that the health clinic going in, I think at roughly 128 or 130 Mississauga Street East, adjacent to the parking lot 5. If it is within 150 meters, will the cannabis store still be able to go ahead, or is there a grandfathering that might take effect, or is that something we need to look into subsequent to this discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If we look at the criteria it doesn't apply to just any medical clinic. It's a medical clinic used to provide addiction treatment services. So if this is a clinic that provides physiotherapy, for example, the criteria doesn't apply to it. Getting back to the other example we talked about earlier, if a cannabis retail store was located within 150 meters of a methadone clinic, for example, which is clearly used for addiction treatment services, then in that case, if it was within 150 meters, it wouldn't comply with our existing criteria.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Crawford. The locational question that comes to my mind is it within 150 meters of the old Bank of Montreal? But again, that's something we can look at subsequently. Tim.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. I'm pretty sure all of the locations you're talking about are within 150 meters. 150 meters is a football field and a half. And I'm pretty sure you can't put 1.5 football fields between the corner of Mississauga and Peter and the Steenhoff building, nor the OMA, which is a city facility, nor the, I would guess, the methadone clinic in the other corner. So I think the important thing to remember is when you decided to allow cannabis retail in your city, it was made quite clear at the time that you were allowed to make recommendation. They would consult with you, but the final decision would be with the province. And we, I think, have done our job, but it sounds like that we have made those recommendations, or we've outlined our criteria to the province. And if they're going to adhere to them, they'll adhere to them. If they're not, they're not. My question, though, would be about what this actual motion is about, and that is the recreational trails and why we are eliminating it in our criteria, assuming that we believe in the other criteria. The idea of a cannabis shop being allowed right along the trail down on the waterfront development, I would think would matter. I'm not sure. If you're going to be sensitive about these other things, why wouldn't that proximity to a recreation trail also matter?
Mr. Crawford.
Through Mr. Mayor, I mean, that's a good question. And I mean, I think you're right. I think this, presents itself to be a bigger question on should the other criteria be removed as well? We're sort of in the infancy stages of, cannabis retail stores. And so I could envision that I come back to council at a later date to look at asking council to consider removing all of the other criteria. As I'd indicated at the onset of the meeting or the presentation of this report, we don't have any criteria for stores that sell liquor, yet we have all this criteria for cannabis. So again, but for the purpose of this report, this is just some, I'm going to call them almost more minor changes. At least in staff's view, the trails are probably the least sensitive use of all the other uses that are identified on the list, such as child care centers, libraries, etc. We thought that perhaps council would be open to removing trails. Trails also are, generally a more, they're not, when people use them, they're sort of moving along and carrying on. They're not sitting there, on the trails for extended periods of time. So they're sort of traveling along with their family. So from that perspective, it didn't jump out at us as a major concern.
Thank you. Thank you both. Not seeing any other hands in the air. Would anybody like the question reread? I will now call the question. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. This will just take an hour. Having a little technical difficulty here. Good. Okay, on to number 2 in this area. With respect to religious workshops in municipal parks. And looks like Mr. Merkley has magically appeared to introduce this particular report. Mr. Merkley.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. This report is requesting council's approval for a policy establishing guidelines for allowing religious worship to occur within municipal parks. While past practice was to generally not permit worship services, recent requests suggest a policy should be implemented to ensure a consistent approach. The recommended policy will allow worship services between the hours of 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., which will have a limited impact on park users. In keeping with historical procedures, and since monetary collections are typical with religious worship, the policy identifies that monetary collections will not be permitted. It is further recommended that each organization be limited to a maximum of 2 events per year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. I will now ask our deputy clerk, or assistant clerk. Thank you very much, Robin. This committee recommends the council as recommended in this very report, CSD 2004, May 19th, 2020, from the CSD or the Community Services Department, policy 7.1.2.5 religious workshop in municipal parks be adopted as set out in the schedule that is in our this very report. Is there a mover and a seconder to put this on the floor for discussion? Moved by Pat, seconded by Tim. I will entertain discussion, questions, comments. Jay. Jay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said Dave. My bad. Just kind of looking at it, in normal circumstances, I think I'd be open to considering it. I think right now, with the COVID pandemic ongoing, I think my personal belief is it sends the wrong message that we're kind of opening up for events in the park. And I think that's something we should be trying to discourage as much as possible. I know it's really tough and it's unfortunate that we have to be doing it. And I wish we could be encouraging it, but I just think it's the wrong message right now. In terms of whether religious entities could be hosting events on a park, I don't really see a huge ethical problem with it. I'm a member at St. Paul's, and I think way back we had done a church picnic at Couchiching Beach Park. So I think there's I don't know what the history is of having church events there, but I would assume that there has been some. So I think historically speaking, there's probably a precedence to say, I don't think it's the worst idea in the world. I just think right now, introducing this as a new concept is maybe it's not quite the right time. Happy to support a delay or to look at this at a later date, but I won't be supporting it today. Thanks.
Microphone, Mayor Clark.
Thanks for bringing this up, Jay. I will say that the timing of your comment is interesting. We just had an additional request come in the last number of days for a religious or a faith-based group to potentially have in-car services potentially on a large piece of property and potentially city property because of COVID. So it is interesting you bring up that point. Anyway, I will now enter, sorry, who else? I don't know if I have anybody else in queue. Tim, queue.
Thanks, Steve. I was going to offer that comment too, that actually this may be the perfect time. We've got a pretty vibrant church community in the city of Orillia, and I know they are looking for ways to meet, and I would think that the park would provide that opportunity to actually safely distance safely distance themselves while conducting a service. But I do have a question to Mr. Merkley. In the report, we refer to who can do this, and we say regardless of denomination. And I'm wondering what we're considering a denomination, and is any religion free to do this, to hold a ceremony there, or are there any parameters at all?
Sure, Mayor Clark. Certainly the requests we've had in the past have been from what I would consider more standard or traditional religious groups, but we hadn't thought of any specific parameters you'd want on limiting that or how we would categorize.
If I could, Mayor Clark, I wonder if we need to add something there at the discretion of the manager of Parks and Rec or something, because we could get some strange requests. Who knows? And I think it would probably behoove us to have some sort of mechanism in place to deal with them right up front, as opposed to letting it get too far down the line before it was considered inappropriate.
I'm not sure what that wording would look like. And yes, Tim, if you got together with all your, what I'll call extremely veteran defensemen and put a group together, I'd be apprehensive about having you use that group in the park as well. But on this one, I'm not sure. Ray, do you have a comment on that?
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Certainly we could add something like that. It always becomes a little sort of judgmental or arbitrary as to how we would define that. I think we would have to think of maybe some specific parameters that we'd want to add to the criteria.
Thank you. Rob, then Jay.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mayor Clark, to Mr. Merkley. Are we getting a lot of requests where churches are kind of bursting at the seams, not having enough space, where maybe they could do their services in the parking lot? And the other criteria would be looking at just keeping this to churches in Orillia and not having like organization churches from down south in Toronto coming up to Orillia for the 3 hours in the morning and having their church services in the park. I'm just wondering if that might be one of the stipulations.
Ray, do you want to accept that as a comment, or would you like to respond?
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Certainly on the first point, the issue arose before the COVID-19 situation. It was really one where we really don't have a policy in place that would prevent it. It's been past practice that we really didn't allow it, save and except one group was doing it. And then we started to get a couple of requests earlier this year about doing events this summer related to that. That's why we decided to that it really should be a council policy, so we do have some guidance as to how we move forward as opposed to just a practice. But then in light of COVID, it's now come about that we haven't received them yet, but our thought is, to Councillor Lauer's point, that maybe more groups will approach us because that is an option of maybe being able to spread out in the park system. So we might get more requests now because of the COVID. And we wanted to have a policy in place and understand council's preference for addressing those type of situations. Certainly on the second point, yeah, that is something that it might be good to add to the policy, is that it's just for current Orillia-based churches.
Thank you very much. Jay, then Ted, then Pat.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, my comedic timing's off. I thought I could interject right away, but I was going to say, watch out for the Church of Lauer if there are any applications coming forward.
Yeah, certainly a dubious distinction, to be sure. Ted.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Just a question. In these times of the COVID-19 virus, does the regulation that groups of more than X cannot meet supersede this situation, regardless of whether they can get separation or not? I believe there is a regulation that they can't happen. And so in that case, it wouldn't be, I don't have a problem with the policy going forward. I am somewhat sympathetic to the view that it should not be applied during the current restrictions.
Thanks for that, Ted. I will say that certainly the gatherings right now are limited to a maximum of 5 people. Even when those restrictions begin to lift to 10 or 25 or 100, whatever that is, all indications are that physical distancing will still be in place. My best guess is it'll be all this year and probably well into next year before that particular restriction is lifted. That is our new short-term and medium-term reality. But Ray, if you're able to, or I might even turn to Madam CAO or our fire chief, my understanding is if you're doing this in cars, which was a request we received recently, that group can be larger, and maybe I'll just look for some clarity from our fire chief, or from our CAO, or from our director of or manager of business development and marketing. Brent, do you have any way on that?
Hey, Mr. Mayor, if I may start.
Sure.
Mr. Mayor, it's my understanding that there is an opportunity for sort of drive-in type events for churches. The vehicles have to be 2 meters apart. And that was one of the requests that the EMC actually just dealt with recently, where an organization was looking for some property in order to enable that kind of service to actually take place. So there are some provisions that have put in place to enable that kind of event.
Indeed, and thank you for that. Good. Pat?
Thank you. Councillor Fowles talked about church picnics. I don't think that that's a church service. So that my thought is that they would still be allowed at the park since they aren't a service. Is that your understanding, Ray?
Mayor Clark, that's correct. This is specifically related to worship services. And to respond to an earlier question too, the policy, if the COVID restrictions are still in place, they would have to abide by whatever those may be at the time. So as groups grow, if we get notice from the province that, it can be a 20, 50, 100 or whatever, as that grows, the policy doesn't preclude them from having to abide by any particular restrictions that are in place from regulations.
Thank you both. Any other further questions, comments, discussion? Ralph?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think this is really early with the virus that's going around. I would like to see if there's any interest in tabling this till next year. I think it's really important that we keep our community safe. Even though it's going to be local, they invite friends from Toronto or wherever it is, and that coming up to our city. So I think it should be tabled till at least next year once this virus is over. If there's I'll move it if there's a seconder.
Sorry, can't hear you, Steve.
I do believe that Jay would be a mover or a seconder, it appears. We did hear that despite when this decision would be made, if it's made, either way that COVID restrictions or COVID measures would still be in place. So just something to consider. But once we've had a thorough discussion on this, then I'll entertain the idea of a postponement. Ray, it looks like you would like to hop back in. What as animated as I ever see you.
Yes, Mayor Clark, just to clarify, currently there is no policy that prevents a group from coming to us and asking to do a service in the park. This is our means to try to at least come up with a consistent policy. We could make it more restrictive and just not allow them at this time. But just to clarify, there is currently no policy that would prevent a religious group from being able to come to us and ask to do something in the park. It's just been past practice not to allow.
Thank you very much for that. I've got Jay, then Tim.
Sorry, no, I was just seconding.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks, Steve. I'm not in favor of tabling this. I don't think we can get ourselves into too much trouble. I have full confidence in the provisions that are currently in place. The EMC has been doing a great job of keeping their eye on all these things and keeping a pretty tight rein on things. So I have confidence in that. Eventually, I mean, people are expressing they like the idea, and it's eventually going to. It sounds like it's eventually going to happen. So I'm quite comfortable doing it now, letting the EMC do their work, and then when the time comes when they lift the restrictions enough, then it's there. And as Ray says, we do have a policy in place.
Thank you very much for that. Any further questions, comments, discussion? Okay, I do have a motion. There's a motion on the floor. We've had a pretty adequate discussion on this, but moved by Ralph and seconded by Jay as a motion to postpone. Is there a particular date to which you would like to consider postponing, Councillor Ralph?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sometime next spring or even February, March, whatever. I just want to make sure that this COVID-19 is over before we allow people to migrate to the park, come into our parks and that. and it's the local people I'm worried about having bringing people in from out of town here that we have no control over. You can see that through our what happened in Toronto at that park, and the same thing could happen here.
Okay. Okay, so I generally when you associate a time frame with a postponement, so I probably would look for one. If you're looking for COVID to be over definitively, you might be a little premature with next February, March, or spring, as you had indicated.
But, Mr. Mayor, let's say March 15th.
March 15th. Jay, are you okay with that as a seconder?
Yeah, I'm happy with it, and fingers crossed it's hopefully long past us by then.
Great. Okay, so moved by Ralph, seconded by Jay, as a motion to postpone this particular resolution until March 15th, 2021. Is there any further discussion on the motion to postpone? I will now call the question. All in favor? That appears to be defeated. I'll now go back to the original resolution. Would anybody like it reread? Yes, thank you.
Steve, if I could, I don't need it reread. I just wanted to clarify one thing about the denomination question and whether staff will be working on some sort of phrasing that just might make that a little tighter and avoid some complications down the line.
I would be, pardon how this may sound funny, but I'd be a little leery of denomination discrimination. But anyway, I'll ask Ray, would you like to respond to that particular question?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Clark. Certainly it is something we can do a little bit more research on and see if there is a definition that we think we could insert within it. That may take a little bit of time to do that, but again, I'm hesitant a little bit to try to think of how we differentiate.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else did ask me to reread this, so I'll do that as well. Moved by Pat, seconded by Tim. That this committee recommends the council as recommended report CSD 2004 dated May 19th, 2020 from the CSD or the Community Services Department, policy 7.1.2.5. Religious workshop in municipal parks be adopted as set out in Schedule A of this very report. I will now, is there any further discussion? I will call the question. All in favor? That is passed. Thank you. This is where we get into the fun stuff. On to report, I think it's departmental number 3, with respect to the Aqua Theater contract award. I'm going to guess by the name on this, one of the names in this report, and by his very presence intermingled with on the screen with council, that Mr. Merkley is going to introduce this one as well, right?
Thank you, Mayor Clark. So this was first brought to council just as the COVID-19 pandemic came upon us. So it was withdrawn at that time, and so it's back here now. This project is to address the structural deficiency of the building in order to address public safety concerns. Completing the project will facilitate the building's use as a public gathering and entertainment space. As all functions in the Aqua Theater are being canceled for the summer of 2020, it is an ideal time to complete the repairs. The city's Rotary Aqua Theater upgrades project will address the critical structural issues and affected architectural finishes. The project involves significant structural repairs, updating architectural materials, a new underground electrical service with increased capacity, and a new lighting package. These improvements will provide a safe structure for current and future use. Based on the bid submitted, there is a requirement for additional $55,000 to be added to the budget in order for the project to be awarded to the lowest bidder. The impact of canceling the tender would require that the project be tendered again at a future date. As the city has now tendered the project twice, it is most likely that the cost to execute the contract will continue to increase each time. This is due to the increasing cost of labor and construction materials, and also due to the optics of the city tendering the project multiple times. In addition, it is unknown how competitive the construction climate will be in the near term with the current industry uncertainty. The low bidder, Yorkton Construction, has confirmed that if awarded in early June, they will hold their bid and complete the construction project in the 2020 construction season. Thank you.
Thank you. And if staff would be so kind as to put the resolution proposed on the screen. That this committee recommends the council that is recommended in report CSD 2002 dated May 19, 2020 from the Community Services Department, the Rotary Aqua Theater capital project project budget be increased by $55,000, and that the increase be funded from the purchase of parkland reserve, and that Yorkton Contracting Limited be awarded the contract for the Rotary Aqua Theater capital project construction for the sum of $537,509, and the mayor and clerk be authorized to execute this the related agreement. As a mover and a seconder to put this on the floor. Moved by Mason, seconded by Pat. Thank you. I'll now entertain discussion. Rob.
Thank you through you, Mayor Clark, to maybe Mr. Merkley. Maybe Councillor Sapola could help answer this question as well. At one time, this was supposed to be a fundraising campaign through the Rotary Club to help facilitate this project and put some dollars towards it. Is that program still happening as well?
Through you, Mayor Clark. Yes, it is. This project is to address basically the building deficiencies and infrastructure. The Rotary Club is interested in raising funds to do some enhancements to the project once the base stuff is completed. Things like upgrading the seating or various things like that.
Okay, thank you. So they're still a good community partner. Great.
Thank you, Rob. I believe I saw your hand up there.
Thank you. Mr. Merkley is absolutely right. This is not part of the Rotary Club's involvement for this tender. We're going up and above this, but Mr. Merkley's suggesting what they suggested in the past.
Thanks, Tim. I get that. Any further questions, comments, discussion? Tim.
Thanks, Mayor Clark. I'm asking this question about this particular tender. I could ask it about any of them. I've just been struck lately by the length of time it's taking to complete projects. And of course, we've got the obvious delay at Foundry Park, but I've also noticed a lot of the smaller projects, the one at Tutta Park, the one at Victoria Park, seem to be taking longer, or they seem to be outside of the season. And in the report, you refer to the references and their ability to complete the projects. How in depth do we actually look at those references, or do we just accept their references, or do we source out our own past performances? Do we actually phone back or investigate exactly their performance? And I wonder, do we know this company at all? Have they done work in Orillia for us?
Sure, Mayor Clark. A few questions there. Certainly, I think we've made the same observation that projects seem to take longer than the scheduled time period overall. I think there's been a few reasons for that in the past, and I think interestingly enough, it's probably the opposite. So in the past, it was a lack of trades due to everybody being extremely busy and spread around. Now we're finding that true with even the during the COVID time, that they're having trouble getting enough trades in to do the jobs, and it's extending the time frame slightly. As far as the reference checks, yes, we do some reference checks they have to provide them. We contact them. Usually other municipalities we look for to make sure they've had no issues with them. Yorkton has not done any specific work for us in the past, but their references did check out from work they've done in other municipalities.
Okay, thanks. Yep, thanks for that. Yep.
Okay, I will say there are some exceptions to your observations, Tim. Because I've had similar observation that you have, but I would suggest the Front Street project that's going on right now, for example, has actually been able to make good headway because of quite frankly, a lack of normal traffic over the last couple of months. So hopefully there's a little trade-off here and there. Any further questions, comments, discussion? Okay, I don't see any other hands in the air, so I will now call, oops, sorry, Pat, go ahead. I saw a finger in the air. An appropriate one.
We know that from experience that if we delay any longer, the cost is only going to go up. And it seems to me that although it's not optimal in some ways because of COVID-19, it's a really good time in other ways because the park is closed to events. So it's a good time to get the work done. And the structure when the park is open is used so much by the community that I think that we need to move forward because the costs are going to go up if we delay any longer. So I really believe that we should be moving forward.
Thank you for that. Anybody want to get the final word in here? Then Pat, you've had the final word. I will now call the question. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Thank you. We have the one issue left with respect to funding of cultural organizations and events or festivals. Before we get Jacqueline involved, we're going to what do you need? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 8 minutes? Yeah, well, I'll give you 10 as a cushion if council will endorse that. So I have 5:35 here. If council is okay to grant a recess till 5:45, that'll be about 10 minutes just to allow staff to separate the resolutions because of the stated conflicts earlier. Is there a mover and a seconder for a 10-minute? Thank you, Mason. Moved by Mason, seconded by Ralph. All in favor? See you in 10 minutes. articulating this on paper and trying to make it as easy as they can for the chair. Before we go there, I believe Madam CEO just wants to make a small point of clarification from a discussion earlier with respect to the potential of faith-based services in our parks or elsewhere. So, Madam CEO.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I can, just in terms of clarification, I wanted to indicate that we've been in discussions with some of the church groups. At this point, they actually do not have a green light to hold ceremonies. What they're working towards is a sort of drive-through concept, as I indicated, with the ability to have the service in a lot, vehicles 2 meters apart, windows up, transmitting through radios and so on. So they are working towards developing an actual framework, but they have not received a green light from the province as of yet. I know the EMC had received a request from one of the groups, and certainly that group is actually pursuing private property owners at this stage, but may come back to the city to see if the city has a parking lot that potentially could be used. But they are working, I gather, with the province to ensure that they would have the ability to move forward to host their events. So just a point of clarification. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam CAO. I know that we have a report right now with respect to funding of cultural organizations and events. I see that we have Mr. Merkley, the Director of Community Services, the Community Services Department. Sorry, we've gone through a recent restructuring in the city, and I'm still getting used to the new handles for the departments. And we have Jacqueline Sashka with us as well. And who is going to be introducing us? Ray or Jacqueline? Ray?
Thank you, Mayor Clark. I will be. The purpose of this report.
Now is your opportune time.
Thank you. The purpose of this report is to present Council Committee with options on how to address the approved 2020 funding of cultural institutions and events in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. The city funds cultural festivals and institutions like the Mariposa Folk Foundation in one of three ways: through the budget deliberations, through the partnership program for cultural festivals and events, and smaller projects are funded through the general grants program. In total, the City of Orillia has approved approximately $241,000 in funding to local festivals, events, and cultural institutions in 2020. To date, only $31,000 is being dispersed through the partnership program and to Streets Alive. With the COVID-19 global pandemic disrupting the ability for people to gather for the foreseeable future, all of the organizations funded through the City of Orillia may face financial challenges in 2020. This report presents three options for Council's consideration. Option one would maintain funding with the caveat that it be used in 2020 and or 2021. Option two would reduce funding based on current realities. And option three would forego funding altogether. Option one in the report provides the funding based on funding proportionate to the amount of expenses occurred by the organization. Based on further discussion, staff have prepared a modification to option one that eliminates the proportionate requirement and only requires the organization to spend at least the amount of the grant. For example, if an organization received $2,500 in funding but only spends $1,000 in 2020, they would only be eligible for $1,500 in additional funding in 2021. So as long as they spend the amount of the grant, then they'll be awarded, the grants will carry forward and they'll be eligible to apply in 2021 as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merkley. Just before we go there, Jay, I've got going to introduce or put on the table the revised motion that Ray referred to. I will read it and ask if there's a mover and a seconder to move this on the table for discussion. Then we're going to get into, instead of having everything all in one motion, because there have been a few declarations of conflict, because there are some people around the table that personally or through their role with charitable organizations or not-for-profit organizations in the communities are involved in sponsorship or through their businesses, which is my case. We're going to be breaking a couple of the aspects of what was the original motion out, and so that people are not taking place in those with respect to the events and or organizations that their sponsorship is directly related to. So the motion is that this committee recommends to council that is recommended in report CSR 2005 dated May 19th, 2020 from the Community Services Department. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the funding allocated in 2020 to the cultural institutions set out in Schedule A of the report that we received, with the exception of Roots North Music Festival, Starry Night Studio and Gallery Tour, and Streets Live, remain status quo in conjunction with the following conditions. Grant funding must be used prior to December 31st, 2021. Because we know all the events have been postponed for this year. As number two, as part of the 2021 grants request, organizations be required to submit a report outlining their use of the 2020 funds and the impact of the COVID-19 on programming and budgets. Number three, any unused city funding would be accrued to the 2020 to 2021 and used to reduce further funding. And number four, should there be no eligible expenses in either 2020 or 2021, organizations would forego city funding with funds already dispersed to be returned to the city of Orillia. Is there a mover and a seconder to put the first aspect out on the floor? Thank you, Mason, and thank you, Dave. I will now entertain discussion on it. Ted.
Thank you, Mayor Clark, and I'd like to thank staff for a clarification today, because I had raised concerns with respect to the funding for the Orillia Museum of Art and History and the Mariposa Folk Foundation. Because neither of those are funded from the cultural grants program by the granting committee. They are both funded by council resolution, and in the case of OMA, a resolution that committed the city to funding for 4 years and has very rigorous and strict reporting requirements every quarter, plus the requirement to appear during our budget period to confirm that their operation. So thank you for doing that. And if I am correct in my assumption after our discussion today, that both those organizations can proceed on the confidence that their funding allocation for this year, and in the case of OMA for the next 2 years, and in the case of the Mariposa Folk Foundation for next year, will proceed. If there is any hesitation on that, my question would be to the deputy clerk would not any change in the funding allocation to those two organizations require a reconsideration of the original funding motions that were passed by this council? I don't believe we have the right under the EMC has the right under the Emergency Act to just arbitrarily change that, and I'm not sure we do either, since all of the funding has been based on previous motions of council.
I will look to our clerk's department for clarification on your question.
Thank you, Mayor Clark, and through you to Councillor Eamon. That's a very valid question, and it's something that Council will need to turn its mind to as it evaluates these types of proposals that staff are bringing forward for direction in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The funding already has been approved, and so this option in particular would work in conjunction with the already approved motion. So it would not be required to bring that original motion that approved the funding back for full introduction. But certainly that is
staff stance on that matter, but council is the ultimate authority on whether any option that staff bring forward should require a reconsideration.
Thank you very much. Further questions, comments? I don't get to speak. Oops, sorry. Go ahead, Rob, and then Jay.
Thank you through you, Mayor Clark. With the contract with Mariposa Folk Festival for the $57,000 for the next 3 years, some of us had received letters asking that they had given $10,000 bonusing for 2020 60th anniversary celebration. They're asking that the extra $10,000 be allocated as well for 2021. I'm just wanting to know moving forward if that has to be a separate motion.
That's a very good point you bring up, Rob. So the request came in from Mariposa Folk Festival or Foundation that the additional $10,000 that we had that we'd already allocated, they've asked that be deferred now from 2020 to 2021. So there's not an additional $10,000. They just want to defer that payment until next year because they aren't able to celebrate their 60th anniversary this year. They are going to celebrate their 60th anniversary in next year, as well as their 20th anniversary in Orillia, if I've got that straight. And Tim, can you nod your head up and down if I've got that right, or Rob?
Yes.
So anyway, so that will be an amendment, which is also apparently an addendum to this main motion, which I will if there's a mover and a seconder, I can put that on the floor right now for the amendment to move that $10,000 that it's already been granted to for that additional celebration in 2021. Is there a mover and a seconder? Thank you, Ralph. Moved by, seconded by Pat. Thank you. Thank you. So as mentioned, moved by Ralph, seconded by Pat, that the motion now before council be amended by adding the following, and that the $10,000 approved for the Mariposa Folk Festival's 60th anniversary be deferred until 2021. Discussion, questions, comments. So I will now call the question. Sorry, Jay, go ahead.
Thanks. I wanted to get, I've gone back and forth on the options 1 and 2, and I'm just trying to kind of understand them to the fullest extent here. With option 1, there would, like, the current amount is guaranteed, but over 2 years. And then with option 2, there would be a reduction, but it's only for a single year. Do I have that right?
Ray, would you please be so kind as to address that? I think Jay's understanding needs just a little bit of an education there.
Mr. Mayor Clark.
That's a good question.
So the option that was read out that we've put forward is saying that as long as the group spends, so let's say their grant is for $15,000, as long as they show that they've spent $15,000 in 2020, then that's fine. They can keep the grant and move on. And next year they can apply for a grant similar that they have in the past. The option in the report originally was saying it was going to be prorated. So you would accrue that number forward and you'd reduce their grant in 2020 if they didn't meet those certain expenditure levels. But that's not the way it is in the motion that's now been presented.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you, Tim.
Steve, I wonder if we can get that motion up again.
Absolutely. If the staff would be so kind. I'll give everybody a moment to review it when it hits the screen.
You have an amendment to deal with.
Perhaps, can we show that as amended or not yet? Oh, sorry, the amendment hasn't passed it yet. So the only addition to this is the proposed amendment that's actually on the table is deferring Mariposa's $10,000 that was allocated for the 60th anniversary celebrations from 2020 to 2021. But this is the motion, the main motion that's also on the floor. How can you see that? Okay, Jay?
Sorry, last question to Mr. Merkley. Just confirming there in reading that. So these organizations would have another opportunity. Let's say they spent their entire grant money this budget cycle. They would have an opportunity to apply for another grant in 2021.
Ray or Jacqueline?
Mayor Clark, that's correct.
Great. Thank you. Ralph, on the amendment?
I'm sorry,
Okay.
no.
If it's okay, I'm going to finish discussion on the amendment, and I'll go back to the main motion, which I probably should have done before the last comment. So is there any further discussion on the amendment to reallocate the $10,000 that's been approved from 2020 to 21 to 2021 for Mariposa's 60th celebration? Ted, comment.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. My comment is, I'm not sure, I'm still feeling uncomfortable that we are amending the wrong motion. I do believe that what we should be doing is accepting this report as information as it deals with OMA and Mariposa Folk Foundation, because I don't believe that those organizations are comparable to the other organizations that are on this list, and that we have made a commitment over a number of years to those organizations, and at this point in time, they are doing, at least I believe that OMA is doing exactly what this resolution is requiring, and that is reporting to council quarterly on whether its expenses should be there. So I would much prefer us to consider removing them and amending it so we receive it as information for those two organizations, and amend that resolution with respect to the $10,000.
We go quite there. Mason.
Yes, through you, Mayor Clark, speaking specifically to the amendment that we have on the table, just for the record, in the past, I did not support the increase of the 10,000, as I thought it'd be better, to increase the ticket prices. But regardless of that discussion in the past, I think it does make sense to essentially defer that payment to 2021, because obviously with Folk Fest not proceeding this year, they're not going to be using those particular funds this year because it was specifically related to that 60th celebration. So I think it's just logical at this point to defer those funds to 2021. So I will be supporting the amendment.
Thank you. And if there is no further discussion on the amendment, I will now call the question on the amendment to the main motion. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Now back to the main motion, and Ted, I understand your suggestion or concern. I would also suggest, and I'll look to staff to confirm this, that this enshrines the continuation of the granting for 2020 and doesn't do anything to 2021 except for an explanation on the COVID-related stuff subsequent to their 2020 spending, I suppose. So if I could look to either Ray or Jacqueline or our CAO, this does indeed enshrine the pre-approved, or they already approved funding for Mariposa and for OMA. And I agree, I believe I'm quite willing to speak to either one of those organizations or both in terms of responsibility and economic impact and responsibility. But I believe this motion does that. And if Ray, maybe, or Jacqueline, somebody wants to, or want to weigh in just to echo my comments or tell me that I'm all wet.
Mayor Clark, it would, the way the motion is written, it would imply, or it would mean that the group would have to spend at least the amount of the grant money in each of those years to get the funding. So in Mariposa's case, they'd have to spend the $50,000 in order to keep the funding, and again in 2021 the same.
And in OMA's case, for example, they'd have to spend $150,000 throughout this year.
Correct.
Okay. Tim, did I see a hand flash there?
Yes, you did. Thanks, Mayor Clark. I also am just wanting to make sure that I am understanding this completely. And it sounds to me like we're status quo, other than we've just added a proviso that they have to account for the money being spent this year, period, right? Other than that, it's business as usual. The grant next year goes on and life hopefully will return to normal, if I'm understanding that correctly. And if I had a question, it would be that in the correspondence we received from Mariposa, they seem to express some disappointment in one aspect of what we were doing, which I couldn't quite get my head around. But as I say, it appears to me that this is status quo, and simply if you don't need the money, then you don't need the money. But if you do, it's there.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. I'm not seeing any contrarian staff hands in the air, so I believe that you have captured it. Ted, I have you in queue.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. I'm also anxious that we treat these major events in our community in the same way we treat our home museum, our opera house, and our library. And I would hope that they're being held to exactly the same standard in terms of their operating funds. I know the library is being closed, OMA is being closed. I don't know, but I understood the library had layoffs. I do know that OMA has laid off its staff. I do receive from the library a bulletin periodically advertising what are quite spectacular online programming, but I get the same thing from OMA, which has shifted its operation to an online operation. So I believe that these organizations, which are significant cultural organizations, are a foundation of small cultural businesses in our community, are doing exactly what we would hope they were doing. And so I find it, I find that it's just unnecessary to have created the stress that it has amongst the board members who have contacted me from both organizations in the last couple of days, wondering what it is that the city's really trying to do here. What I believe we're trying to do is to apply the same rules to the $5,000 grants that we apply to the hundreds of thousands of dollar grants that we provide to large organizations, and I just don't think that's correct. So, but under the assurance that the status quo is the same, that there is no change, I will be voting in support of this motion, though it's not my preferred direction. Right? Does it deliver the message I believe our city wants to deliver to those organizations?
Thank you for that. Further questions, comments, discussion? Ralph? Was there a question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. These organizations that we're talking about, the last three anyways that we talked about, the economic benefit, as the report indicates, is incredible. So all the support that we can give them is fantastic. My only question is, if Roots North, because of COVID-19, doesn't go forward, what happens? Because it could be, we don't know whether they're going to be able to have it. And if they spend money before they get the authority to have it from the province and that, what happens to that money, whether it's any one of those three?
Ralph, so I appreciate the question. I think there's some validity to the question, but that's not the motion that's before us at the moment. This is strictly the the other granting opportunities with the exception of Roots North, with the exception of Starry Night, and with the exception of Streets Alive. So those are becoming somewhat in short order before us. Further questions, comments? And if you'll allow me, then I would like to, and Councillor Dave, where's Dave? Right there in the middle. You're Paul Lynn today, Dave. And I know you're just old enough to remember that reference. When I step away from the discussion with respect to Starry Night, Streets Alive, and Roots North music, I would ask that you take the chair. Thank you. I know you have no trepidations about that whatsoever. Anyway, I am taking some comfort in this. I do commend staff for ensuring that our money is being used responsibly. And I think, as Ted has indicated and others may have indicated, that they believe that is the case, certainly for the events that they've spoken for. These are exceptional times, and it calls for exceptional behavior and decisions sometimes. I just want to remind everybody that's watching at home that these grants have already all been pre-awarded or approved, and so there's no adjudication on actually the actual funding. It's just on the motion that's before us. I do believe, and I know the Economic Recovery Task Force is working extremely hard to ensure a few things, not just the survival of our economy and hopefully the strong viability of our local economy, but also establishing for our citizens as we come through this a sense of normalcy. And I would suggest that having a very strong arts and cultural community, which has always been part of the city of Orillia, or the Sunshine City's makeup, is certainly a part of that normalcy, and if not a large part. The culture in this city, we were, as everybody around this table knows and elsewhere knows, a couple of years ago, we were awarded the Cooperative Communities Award for being the most caring, giving, philanthropic community in all of Ontario. Part of the criteria was that we had a strong vibrant arts and cultural community. And this further is a demonstration of that, should we support this today. These events, and certainly some of them in particular, go a long way to defining exactly who we were, who we are, and who we are likely to be going forward. So I believe creating that sense of normalcy for our citizens will give some confidence that we are getting back to normal slowly, and that they are free to responsibly come out and behave. As I mentioned, the ERTF, or the Emergency Response Task Force, which our Business Development Department and Ted is chairing with Dave and Ralph, is not just doing what some people would think are the obvious economic considerations with respect to commerce or industrial, but certainly the not-for-profit sector and the cultural sector. I further believe that OMA has, as Ted mentioned a few minutes ago, clearly demonstrated over the last few years, not only that they have been responsible with the money that has been granted to them from the city, but they've gone a long way to increasing the revenue stream, and which means they've increased the vibrancy and the activity at OMA, the Orillia Museum of Art and History. And actually each year, the money that the city has granted to OMA has gone down as a percentage of their overall operational budget. The Mariposa, certainly, probably the largest event. I'm sure it is the largest event that we have one of the largest in this region, certainly the largest in Orillia, with tens of thousands of people over a July weekend each year. Very tough decision for them to have to cancel activities this year. I do know that there were significant costs, even with the cancellation ahead of time. There are deposits that were given up early. So I believe that demonstrating that this money has been spent and spent responsibly will be very easy for them to do. They also are part of a national festival network, and I know that they are renowned and looked highly upon by this national organization, because they're often looked to see it as for benchmarking in Canada. What is Mariposa doing so that some of the other events nationally follow their direction? And if there ever was a time to support culture, not just for viability and for definition who we are, but for their mere survival, I believe it is right now. So I am in full support for this. And just like Ted said, I will thank staff for retooling this motion. And so not only in support of the amendment, which has already been passed by council, but certainly in support of this resolution. And thank you very much for your patience and your time in allowing me to speak to that from the actual chair. Is there any further discussion, questions, or comments with respect to the motion before us? I will now call the question. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Steve, we can't hear you there.
No, thank you. So I was just clarifying something with our deputy clerk. Thank you, Jay. So Dave, this is where I'm going to have you take over. There are two subsequent motions, and I will ask staff to put them on the screen for you so you can read them. Then ask for a mover and a seconder, and then you can ask for discussion and certainly look for the hands to go in the air as a result. Are there any questions before I step away from the chair? Dave?
Yeah, couldn't someone else do this?
If you would really prefer, because I know you haven't.
I'm kidding. I'm fine. I'm fine.
But if you do have any questions, I know that it's becoming. If you do have any questions, you can certainly ask those of our CAO or our clerk's department.
Of course. Thank you.
Jay, I will let Dave entertain your question.
Yeah, I didn't think that my initiation to the chair would occur quite like this, but I'll see if I can fumble my way through this. Jay, before we get to those motions, did you want to make a comment?
Just a quick snarky remark here. I think this is the first time in the history of Orillia where the clerk and the chair are in different buildings.
Ooh, that may very well be. So I will turn to the assistant clerk there to put those motions on the floor here and we will be dealing with these all together. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. So this is encapsulates the provisions with respect to Roots North Music Festival and Starry Night Studio and Gallery Tour only, and we have a subsequent motion related to the Streets Alive that will occur after this.
Okay, thank you. I just wondered if that was separated out because I knew there was a different conflict there. So I'll read this motion and then I'll look for a mover and a seconder, and then we'll entertain some discussion. That this committee recommends to council that as recommended in report CSR 2005 dated May 19th, 2020 from the Community Services Department, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the funding allocated in 2020 to the Roots North Music Festival and Starry Night Studio and Gallery Tour remains status quo in conjunction with the following conditions. Grant funding must be used prior to December 31st, 2021. As part of their 2021 grant requests, organizations may be required to submit a report outlining their use of the 2020 funds and the impact of COVID-19 on programming and budgets. 3, any unused city funding would be accrued to 2021 and used to reduce further funding. And 4, should there be no eligible expenses in either 2020 or 2021, organizations would forego city funding with funds already dispersed to be returned to the city of Orillia. Okay, and I'll ask for a mover and a seconder for that. And we have Mason and Rob. And now we'll entertain some discussion. Pat, go ahead. Okay, Rob. Pat.
Thank you. Just a question. If the province doesn't allow festivals outside, what happens with them, with the 2020 money that Roots North yeah, Roots North is probably the one that's most affected here, is it not?
Mr.
All right.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Sepola. I would think, so Roots North is mostly held indoors through various venues across the city. Starry Night is also, it's an indoor-outdoor festival with street closures. Depending on the regulations, which we obviously can't predict, there may be situations where are you speaking to 2020 specifically with respect to this question, or, okay. So Roots North has already canceled, and Starry Night is still in a bit of a holding pattern. They're trying to reinvent themselves. This motion basically suggests, and similar to the other motion, that should they incur the amount of the grant they've been awarded, that money would still be allocated to the grant recipient.
Okay. And Pat, I believe you are next. Fiona? Okay. Anyone else? Seeing no one, I will therefore call a question. All in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. And we will wait for, we have the other motion, which I'll ask to be brought up on the screen. Okay, this committee recommends to council that as recommended in report CSR 2005 dated May 19th, 2020 from the Community Services Department, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the funding allocated in 2020 to Streets Alive remains status quo in conjunction with the following conditions. 1, grant funding must be used prior to December 31st, 2021. 2, as part of their 2021 grant requests, organizations may be required to submit a report outlining their use of the 2020 funds and the impact of COVID-19 on programming and budgets. 3, any unused city funding would be accrued to 2021 and used to reduce further funding. And 4, should there be no eligible expenses in either 2020 or 2021, organizations would forego city funding with funds already dispersed to be returned to the city of Orillia. And we'll move that off the screen, and I will look for a mover and a seconder, please. And we have Mason and Ted. And any questions? Ted and then Ralph.
Thanks, Tim. Mr. Chair, I do believe Councillor Sepola declared conflict on this issue and should not be on the screen at this time.
Oh,
that's exactly why I put my hand up, Ted.
Okay. So not only will he not be speaking to this, but he will be leaving the room. My apologies. Rookie mistake. We'll call it that. Okay, so that means that we, I believe the mover was Mason, and then I need a seconder. Oh, it was Ted. Okay. And so then any questions? Tim, go ahead.
Just quickly, am I to assume the Streets Alive is going to go ahead without too much of restrictions? I assume they won't be able to do maybe their opening event in the same manner they have in the past. But I assume that all the art is in process already, and that we could see a Streets Alive installation this summer.
Ms. Sochka?
Thank you through you, Mr. Chair and Councilor Lauer. That event, because it's so tied to the 60th anniversary of Mariposa, it has been postponed to 2021. Because of the nature of that event, there's a lot of upfront costs that have been already incurred. So there may be a reimagining. She's working on the peace signs that were to go with the festival, but the major festival has been moved to 2021.
Okay, Pat?
So will they put up some of the old art on the main street just to have a presence on the main street instead?
Thank you through you, Mr. Chair, to Councilor Heath. That is something I will discuss with the organizer. That is something that typically is done, and I believe they're also working on the peace signs. It's something that may go up on the street signs this year, or the street posts this year, but that is something, a great question.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, seeing no hands, I will call the question. All in favor? And that is carried. All right, and now we'll look for Mayor Clark to return. And of course, our other council colleagues. Thank you.
Well, baptism by fire, Dave, you did a commendable job. And getting into the actual chair will be a piece of cake for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
We have no inquiries, at least that I'm aware of. Councillor Lauer.
Sorry, Steve, I don't have an inquiry as such, but I have an inquiry about the inquiries. I'm just wondering.
That's quite an acceptable inquiry in itself.
What's that?
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I wonder maybe if Madam CAO could respond. I'm just curious. I know in my own book, I've got a couple of inquiries, nothing too major, but I'm just wondering, is there an appropriate time to bring them forward? Is this an appropriate time to bring, not let's meet this meeting, but during this period? Are we okay to bring them forward, or what is the policy?
Great question. I will turn to Madam CAO for just a brilliant response.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. Through you, just as a reminder to members of council, we certainly still have a number of staff that are on temporary suspension. Having said that, if there is a specific item that you are looking to bring forward as an inquiry, please reach out to either myself or the general manager or director that is responsible for the issue, and we can assist with drafting and giving you a sort of time frame. We are trying to amp back up in terms of certainly with projects. So we have called back some staff in order to assist us to move forward with those projects, but we do currently at this time still have a number of people that are off on temporary suspension. But please, I encourage members of council to either reach out to me directly or to the general manager or director of the area that you're looking to have some work done, and we would be happy to have that discussion with you in terms of timing.
For the inquiry regarding inquiries, and thank you for the answer. Just enough time for my tablet to kick off. Exactly. And if it's okay, I will ask members of council to hold their announcements until we get into council, which will happen in about 37.5 seconds. Open public forum, Madam Deputy Clerk, nothing was received. That's great. Just a reminder that people can submit those open public forum submissions to mwilliams@orillia.ca. I will now call for a motion to adjourn so we can go into council. Moved by Mason, seconded by Jay. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. See you in 12 seconds. Oh, sorry. Of course. Sorry, gang. They actually, there is some paperwork that has to be done. We got to capture what was done in the council committee and form a report quickly for council. So that will take 10 minutes, but this time really should be 10 minutes. So you can take me to task if not. So it's 22 C at 10:02. Thank you. We are back at it. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for staff for converting everything from council committee to regular meeting of council. I will now call this meeting to order. And I'll just ask staff to remove the flag just for a moment, if that's possible. Oh, actually, never mind. It's okay. I can do this. Through the magic of electronics, we're all here. Beautiful. Thank you, council, for your patience, and for those watching at home. Remember, those watching at home, you can always turn the channel if this gets too exciting. Anyway, I will ask staff to queue up O Canada, which looks like it's already done, and we will stand and for our national anthem.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
If you would please remain standing, members of council, we're going to observe a moment of silence for personal contemplation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Would somebody be so kind from the virtual floor to make a motion to approve, or put his motion forward to approve the agenda? Moved by Rob, seconded by Mason. Thank you. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Any disclosures of interest? Rob and Ralph, I believe that you probably have one.
Yes, through you, Mayor Clark, just regards to Streets Alive, the funding, I will be declaring a conflict because my company is a supporter.
Thank you. Maybe I'd look to the clerk's department for what clause that is. Clause 8. Thank you. And Councillor Spool, Ralph?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also have one because Streets Alive, the Rotary Club sponsors one of their items.
Thank you. And so that's also clause 8, and I will be declaring on clauses 7 and 8 with respect to, well, because I have a business that helps to sponsor 3 events, Starry Night, Streets Alive, and Roots North. So thank you for that. No presentations or deputation minutes from May 4th, 2020 regular meeting of council, May 11th, 2020 special meeting of council, budget committee report 2020-1, and May 11th, 2020 special council meeting, emergency measures bylaw. Excuse me, nothing under correspondence. Reports. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. I neglected to get approval of the minutes. Somebody make a motion to approve the minutes. Thank you, Dave. Seconded by Pat. Thank you. Any discussion, errors or omissions for approval? All in favor? Carried. Thank you. With respect to reports, we have one report, number 2027 of Council Committee. which is basically a result of our deliberations over the last 3 hours almost. Wow. That report, actually, I'll wait for the motion to come on the screen. I will be looking for a mover and a seconder in a moment. The report number 2020-7 of Council Committee now before Council be adopted with the exception of clauses 7 and 8, which shall be introduced separately. Is there a mover and a shaker for that resolution? Moved by Ted, seconded by Dave. Thank you very much. Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? Thank you. Just for clarity, thank you, Megan. For those watching at home, that probably seemed like it happened fairly quickly, and it did. That captured most of the discussions that we had in the previous meeting, and that's why that went fairly quickly. And so I just did that pass, right? So thank you. Now I think this is where we have, right. So Councillor David, if you would be so kind, I'm going to step away from both of these clauses, and then I suspect that Rob and Ralph will step away from clause 8. So this is yours, Dave, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. So we'll deal with clause 7. If we could get that up on the screen, please. That clause 7 of report 2020-7 of Council Committee now before Council be adopted. Could I get a mover and a seconder for that, please? Moved by Ted, seconded by Mason. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. And now we'll move on to clause 8, and I think Ralph and Rob will be stepping out of that one. Thank you. And the motion reads that clause 8 of report 2020-7 of Council Committee now before Council be adopted. Could I have a mover and a seconder for that, please? And Mason and Pat, any questions or comments? Seeing none, all in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. Okay, and that brings us back to Mayor Clark.
Dave, you've left big shoes to fill. We are now into consent agenda. Staff, are we aware of any of the 3 items being pulled for a potential change of direction?
No, at this time, Mayor Clark.
Thank you very much. I will now entertain a motion to capture the 3 items. Just so the staff or the people the staff are well aware of this. So people watching from home, consent agenda is not completely unlike what we did a few minutes ago, capturing the report items from the Council Committee. This consent agenda deals with certain items that are captured together on the same motion. They are as follows: the Orillia Museum of Art and History first quarterly report. Number 2, request from the Terry Fox Run. Thank you for that, Madam Deputy Clerk. Requesting financial assistance. And the last one is with respect to the Orillia Jazz Festival, also requesting financial assistance. And those 2 items are the motion before us is to contemplate sending them to the Grants Committee for contemplation and back to Council at some point. So the motion is on the screen before us that Council adopt the recommendations as set out on the consent agenda for the regular meeting of Council held on this very day, May 25th, in the heart of COVID-19, 2020. Any discussion, questions, comments? I will call the question. All in favor? Sorry, I do need a mover and a seconder. Very sorry. Apparently that's how this parliamentary system works. Moved by Mason, seconded by Dave. Thank you very much. There was no discussion. I will now call the question. All in favor? Thank you for allowing that gaffe, and thank you for Madam Deputy Clerk for pointing it out. Thank you. To capture everything that we've done, we have a couple of bylaws to contemplate. I will put the first ones on the screen. I will magically, well, that was perfect timing too. Is there a mover and a seconder to put these on the floor for discussion? Thank you, Ralph, and seconded by Mason. Mason, I see your hand there. Thank you. The screen was just transitioning, so I didn't quite see it. And they are as follows. 2020-47, a bylaw to authorize the execution on an agreement between the City of Orillia and Monera Solutions Corporation online payment of dog licenses. This bylaw authorizes the mayor and clerk, thank you, sometimes pronounced Clark and sometimes mayor and clerk are the same thing, to execute on behalf of the corporation of the City of Orillia an agreement with Monera Solutions Corporation to enable online payment of dog licenses set out in the CIP memo dated May 4th, 2020 from the Clerk's Department. 2020-48, a bylaw to amend certain chapters of the City of Orillia Municipal Code to incorporate housekeeping amendments, chapters 12, 22, 116, 251, 452, 456, 457, 459, 489, 538, 677, 25, 832, 877, 1019, 1020, and 1047. This bylaw amends certain municipal code chapters to address housekeeping amendments where minor corrections regarding format, spelling, grammar, or verbiage or title changes are required as set out in the CIP memo dated just a few days ago, May 19th, 2020 from the Clerk's Department. 2020-49, thank you, Madam Assistant Clerk. Amendment number 119 to traffic and parking regulation bylaw number 200755 as amended. This bylaw amends a traffic and parking regulation bylaw to repeal a heavy truck restriction on West Street from Fittins Road to Coldwater Street as recommended by Council Committee. In 2020-50, a bylaw to amend Chapter 251 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code Delegated Authority. This bylaw amends Chapter 251 of the City of Orillia Municipal Code Delegated Authority to remove city-owned recreational trails from the criteria and change how the minimum 150-meter setback is determined from specified uses for cannabis retail stores as recommended by Council Committee. Is there any discussion, questions, comments? I will call the question on those bylaws. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Now we'll look for a confirmation bylaw. Great timing, by the way, on the transition there, Rocket. I mean, Ms. Cadeau. There it is right there. That bylaw number 2050, bylaw number 2020-51, a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council at its meeting held today, May 25th, 2020, be enacted. Is there a mover and a seconder? Moved by Jay, seconded by Dave. Is there any further discussion on that amendment? All in favor? Sorry, that's not an amendment, it's on a bylaw. All in favor? Thank you, that is carried. Thank you. Any announcements? David.
A comment and an announcement, if I can get away with it. Throughout my time as a councillor, Mayor Clark, you would read a motion, a rather long motion, and I had this running joke when you asked if anyone would like it reread that I would pretend to put my hand up. And having sat in the chair today, I no longer find that joke funny and will never do it again. But anyway, my announcement.
Sorry, Councillor Campbell, just as a bit of a rebuttal there, that doesn't preclude the person who's sitting in the chair requesting that of you when you're in the chair.
Fair enough. My announcement, I wanted to wish our fellow councillor, Rob Klustra, a very, very happy birthday tomorrow. I hope you have a great day, Rob, and enjoy yourself.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody.
Are you disclosing?
Born in 72.
All right, 38 years old. Good for you. You're just a young buck. Okay, I would like to announce and thank you, Councillor Heen, for bringing this to my attention that this is National Paramedic Week, and just want to give a shout out to our paramedics. Our first responders are valuable throughout the whole entire year at many different times, but certainly the COVID issue presents special issues and brings an extra inherent potential danger to the job. It's a job that I know has long shifts, and somebody else wishing you happy birthday, I see. Long shifts and shift work, so often people working throughout the night. And it's also a job, like I like to suggest to the police do a job where they tend to see people who not always in their best form. And certainly with our paramedics, it's somewhat similar that when they see people on their job, it's genuinely because people have a significant concern. And so it's not always a joyous occasion. And so just a hats off and a shout out to our paramedics for this week and for all year long. Any further announcements? Seeing none, I'm open public forum. Nothing. Again, thank you, M. Williams at Orillia.ca. And I will now call for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Mason, seconded by Pat. All in favor? Thanks, gang. It's good to see you virtually. Can't wait till we're all back together in person at some point. Take care.
Stay safe, everyone.
Take care.